Do you find it funny that I'm confronting you in front of everyone?
Adapted from your uploaded source, Grant Holloway grabbed his pregnant wife by the wrist, just as Phoebe took half a step back to get away from him. In the grand ballroom of the Glassbank Hotel in Cincinnati, under the bright glow of crystal chandeliers, dozens of faces turned at the same time. Phoebe Langston Holloway, 35 years old and more than 7 months pregnant, immediately brought her free hand to the curve of her belly beneath her ivory maternity dress. "Let go of me," she said. Grant did not let go. He pulled her toward him without taking his eyes off the phone she was holding tightly against her chest. A glass on the nearby table trembled before tipping over and spilling water across the white linen. Sienna Naroit. Standing a few yards away, froze. Behind her, Harriet Holloway, Grant's mother, had already risen from her chair. Phoebe warned him a second time. Grant kept tightening his grip around her wrist. She planted her feet against the polished stone floor, turned her body to shield her belly, and kicked him hard in the torso. Grant stumbled backward. His back struck a chair. The legs of the chair scraped across the floor before he fell into the open space between 2 rows of guests. The sharp crash of breaking glass cut through the music. Several people stood at once. At that exact moment, the tall doors at the back of the ballroom opened. A group of people in official jackets entered. Grant pushed one hand against the floor and got to his feet. He looked at them, then at Phoebe, and suddenly smiled. It was the smile of a man who still believed everything was happening exactly the way he had planned. That smile lasted only a few more seconds. 3 months earlier, Phoebe still believed the most worrying thing about her marriage was that Grant had started coming home later and later. She had just entered her 6th month of pregnancy when her obstetrician asked her to reduce her workload almost completely. That morning, Phoebe sat on the edge of the exam table with both hands holding the report in front of her belly. Sunlight passed through the white curtains and drew a thin bright line over the practical office shoes she still refused to stop wearing. The doctor did not order full bed rest, but the tightening in Phoebe's abdomen had become more frequent. Her blood pressure was unstable, and the long workdays were no longer safe for her stage of pregnancy. Phoebe had been responsible for financial control at Holloway Property Services, the regional facilities and commercial leasing company where Grant, 36, held a senior operations role. Her work was not glamorous. Most days meant reviewing spreadsheets, invoices, payment calendars, vendor expenses, approvals, and the small inconsistencies that had to be caught before any file moved forward. Phoebe was good at it. She knew when a number looked wrong, when a date did not fit, and when a signature had been placed somewhere too conveniently. She believed she would step away for only a few months, deliver the baby, recover, and return, once life settled into a new rhythm. On the day she finished handing over her responsibilities, Grant drove to the company himself to pick her up. He took the laptop bag from her at the building entrance, placed it in the trunk, and shut it with a firm smile. "You rest now," he said. "The company will not fall apart just because you are gone for a few months." Phoebe laughed. At the time, the sentence sounded like comfort. She did not know a day would come when she remembered every word with absolute precision. During the first 2 weeks, Grant still came home before dinner. He bought the fruit her doctor recommended, reminded her to take prenatal vitamins, and sometimes placed his palm against her belly, waiting for the baby to move. After that, meetings started running late. Then came dinners with business partners. Grant's phone, which had once stayed beside his plate during meals, began lying face down on the table. One night, Phoebe stepped out of the bedroom just as he was speaking on the balcony. The moment he saw her through the glass, his voice dropped. The call ended less than 10 seconds later. Phoebe stood by the sliding door with a glass of water in one hand. "Who was that?" she asked. "Work," Grant said. He slipped the phone into his pocket and walked past her into the apartment. Phoebe did not ask more. She did not want the last months before their daughter was born to become a chain of days spent checking every message her husband received. The next prenatal appointment had been marked on the refrigerator calendar for almost a month. Grant had promised to come. That morning, Phoebe put on her coat and waited in the living room for nearly 20 minutes. When she called him, traffic noise came through the line. Grant was silent for a few seconds before he remembered. He said an urgent meeting had come up. That night, he returned with a bouquet of white flowers. Phoebe placed them in a vase and did not reproach him. Grant kissed her forehead, asked how the appointment had gone, and listened to barely half of her answer before his phone vibrated. He went back out to the balcony. Phoebe stayed in the kitchen cutting the ribbon around the flowers. The scissors stopped halfway through the ribbon when she heard him laugh softly beyond the glass. It was not the tone he used on work calls. When Grant came back inside, she simply lowered her gaze and kept cutting. 3 days later, a courier brought a gray envelope to the apartment. The company name appeared in the upper left corner. Phoebe thought it was an insurance document, or some remaining paper from the handover process. She opened it at the dining table. Inside was a payment confirmation. Her eyes moved across the amount, the recipient entity, and then stopped near the bottom of the page. The approval line carried her name, Phoebe Langston Holloway. Beside it appeared a signature so familiar, she could have recognized it at a glance. Phoebe pulled out a chair and sat down. She looked at the date on the document, then turned toward the prenatal appointment calendar still attached to the refrigerator. On that exact day, she had spent almost 4 hours at the clinic. She had not set foot in the company. Yet someone had signed her name. Phoebe did not call Grant immediately. She sat by the dining table with one hand on the edge of the document and the other pulling down the medical calendar from the refrigerator. The date on the payment confirmation left no room for confusion. That morning, she had arrived at the clinic shortly after 8. She had gone through 2 checks, and then stayed under observation because her abdomen kept tightening. Her mother, Denise Langston, had even brought her a cardigan close to noon and stayed until the doctor allowed Phoebe to go home. Phoebe remembered the bright lights above the observation bed, the sound of carts rolling in the hallway, and the warm water her mother had placed beside the bed. There had been no moment that day when she had gone to the office, let alone sat before a file to approve the payment now resting on her table. She held the document near the window. Late afternoon, light came diagonally through the glass and made the signature easier to see. At first glance, it was exactly hers. The long P, the slight upward lift near the end of Holloway, the line she had written the same way for years. But the longer she studied it, the more uncomfortable one detail became. It was too perfect. A person who signs hundreds of documents always leaves small differences in slant, pressure, spacing, or speed. This signature looked like a scanned piece cut from another file and placed exactly where it needed to be. Phoebe still did not want to draw conclusions. She folded the medical calendar, placed both documents back in the envelope, and waited for Grant to come home. Close to 9 that night, the lock finally turned. Grant entered with his coat over one arm and his phone still in his palm. He saw Phoebe at the table, then looked at the cold dinner plate. "You have not eaten," he said. Phoebe did not answer immediately. She pushed the gray envelope toward him. Grant pulled out the confirmation and read it from beginning to end faster than she expected. He did not show clear surprise. Only a slight frown appeared before he sat down. "Accounting probably reused an old template," he said. Phoebe asked why an old template appeared in a document dated exactly when she had been at the clinic. Grant turned the page over and tapped the edge of the table twice with his fingers. He explained that many payments were prepared in advance, and that the system date could reflect when a file was completed, not necessarily when Phoebe personally signed it. If she had heard that explanation from anyone else before, Phoebe would have demanded an immediate procedural review. But this was Grant, the man who had worked with her for years, the man who had spent the final nights of every quarter across from her, reviewing figures line by line until nearly dawn. So she tried to find something reasonable in his explanation, a way to let the matter go. She pointed to the signature. "It looks like a scanned image." Grant glanced again, then leaned back. "Maybe they really did pull it from an older template. You have been away from work, so do not stress yourself over administrative errors," he said it gently. But the last phrase made Phoebe go silent. "Before?" Grant would never have treated a misplaced signature as harmless, especially when the person who supposedly signed had not been present. He rose to pour himself water, asked what she wanted to eat, then began talking about a meeting that had lasted all afternoon. His rhythm was so familiar that if the document had not been on the table, Phoebe might have let her doubts fade. She watched him move through the kitchen, open the refrigerator, answer a message, and place the phone face down on the table again. Just as he had done for weeks, Phoebe did not ask who had written. She folded the confirmation and placed it inside a blue folder with her prenatal records. Not because she believed Grant was lying, at least then. She still would not allow herself to think that. She knew only one simple thing. If her name appeared on a document she had never signed, she had to keep it. The next morning, Harriet Holloway came to the apartment with 2 bags full of baby things. Grant mother, 59, arranged each item on the sofa as if preparing a careful display. A cream blanket, newborn clothes, a soft swaddle, and white socks so tiny Phoebe could cover them completely with one hand. For a few minutes, the room felt calmer. Harriet asked whether Phoebe was sleeping well, whether the baby moved often, and reminded her to rest instead of thinking about returning to the company too soon. But when Phoebe mentioned that Grant had forgotten her last medical appointment, Harriet's hands stopped in the middle of folding the blanket. "He is carrying part of your work now, too," Harriet said. "Do not call him so much." Phoebe looked at her mother-in-law. Harriet did not say it with obvious reproach. She even smoothed the blanket before setting it down. That calm made the sentence more unsettling. A missed medical appointment, several dinners Grant had skipped, balcony calls that ended as soon as Phoebe appeared. All of it seemed to be grouped under one explanation. Her pregnancy and her temporary absence from work had become pressure on him. Phoebe did not argue. She walked Harriet to the door, returned to the living room full of baby things, and stood still for a few moments while the washing machine turned steadily in the hallway closet. 2 days later, Phoebe was placing baby clothes in a drawer when her phone vibrated on the bed. The name on the screen made her hands stop. Molly Tran, 34, had worked directly under Phoebe in the finance department and had barely contacted her since the handover. Molly asked about Phoebe's health and the baby. But then her voice slowed noticeably. "Phoebe, were you back at the office on Tuesday?" Phoebe went straight to the kitchen and checked her prenatal calendar. "No. I was at the clinic that day." On the other end, keyboard sounds stopped completely. Molly remained silent so long that Phoebe had to say her name. Finally, Molly spoke in a low voice. "Then something is wrong, because I am looking at another file approved under your name." Molly did not send the document immediately. She read the file name, the approval date, and an amount large enough for Phoebe to understand that this was not part of any paperwork completed before her leave. Molly Tran was careful. She never called only to share a suspicion. She explained that the file had passed through her area that morning, and Phoebe's name appeared in the approval field. "I thought maybe you had returned to handle a few things remotely," she said. Phoebe stood by the kitchen table, looking at the medical calendar in front of her. "I did not sign anything." Silence came again. Molly did not try to speculate. She told Phoebe to keep any document bearing her name and not rush to call it a registration error until they understood why it had happened. The call lasted less than 5 minutes. But Phoebe stayed in the same place with the phone in her hand, staring at the blue folder on the table. 1 document could be an error. 2 made that explanation much less believable. That afternoon, Grant came home late. Phoebe had planned to ask about Molly's call, but when she heard the door open, she changed her mind. Grant looked tired, removing his watch as he said the day had been too much. His phone vibrated twice inside his jacket pocket. He checked the screen, silenced it, and asked whether Phoebe had eaten. She watched the gesture, then said only that she was sleepy before going to the bedroom. Phoebe still did not know exactly what she suspected. Part of her wanted to wake the next morning to a simple explanation. Someone selected her name by mistake. The system preserved old permissions. A careless employee used the wrong approver. If she asked Grant then, she feared she would receive another answer, just reasonable enough to stop her questions. 3 nights later, Phoebe woke to a contraction that tightened her abdomen from side to side. She sat up slowly and waited for the sensation to pass. As it had other times, less than 10 minutes later, she felt it again. The bedside clock showed almost 11. Grant had texted earlier that he needed to stay at the company to resolve a meeting that was running long. Phoebe called him. No answer. She waited a minute and tried again. By the third call, the hand resting on her belly had gone cold. The fourth call went directly to voicemail. Phoebe got up to find her coat. But another contraction forced her to hold the edge of the closet. She called a fifth time. Then a sixth. Finally, she called her mother. 20 minutes later, Denise appeared at the door with her hair uncombed and a coat thrown over her house clothes. She did not ask where Grant was. She helped her daughter down the stairs, placed one hand behind Phoebe's back, and took her to the clinic. Under the cold white lights, Phoebe lay in an observation bed, listening to the steady beat of the baby through the monitor beside her. The doctor said the numbers remained within normal range. The contractions could be caused by exhaustion, and Phoebe needed more rest. She nodded. Only after the nurse left did she look at her phone. The 6 calls to Grant remained unanswered. Near 7 the next morning, Grant finally appeared at the apartment. Phoebe had just returned with Denise. He entered quickly, sleep still written across his face, and said his phone battery had died and he had fallen asleep at the office. When he learned Phoebe had gone to the clinic, he sat beside her, asked what the doctor said, and placed his hand on her knee. Phoebe explained briefly that the baby was fine. He released a sigh of relief, leaned in to kiss her hair, and apologized. Every gesture belonged to the same man she had shared years with. That made it harder to know where to put the 6 unanswered calls. 2 days later, resting on the sofa, Phoebe saw a photograph posted by one of the company employees. It was from an internal dinner held on the exact night she had gone to the clinic. In the photo, Grant stood at the end of a table with a white shirt and a glass in one hand. Beside him was Sienna Royce, 27, an employee from communications and events whom Phoebe had seen a few times before her leave. The space between them was smaller than necessary for a group picture. Phoebe looked at the timestamp, then at the caption. The photograph had been taken after 10 at night. Grant had not been sleeping at the office. Phoebe did not call him. She opened the medical profile in her phone, found the emergency contact section, and deleted Grant name. In the replacement line, she wrote her mother name. The operation took less than a minute. No argument, no tears, only the soft sound of her fingertip touching the screen. Phoebe returned to the photograph and enlarged Sienna's wrist. The restaurant lights reflected on a thin bracelet with a blue teardrop stone. Phoebe sat upright. 3 weeks earlier, while taking a bag from Grant's car trunk, she had seen a small gift box hidden under his coat. The lid had been slightly open, enough for her to see that same bracelet inside. When she asked about it, Grant said it was a company gift prepared for a business partner. Phoebe looked again at the bracelet on Sienna's wrist. For the first time, she stopped searching for another explanation for her husband. Some marriages do not break the day a third person appears. The crack often begins earlier, in a moment so small that the person inside the marriage still tries to explain it away for the other. For Phoebe, it was not only the bracelet on Sienna's wrist, or the dinner photo. What she could not forget were the 6 unanswered calls on the night she needed the clinic. While the person she trusted to stand beside her was elsewhere, and later chose to lie. Perhaps the most painful moment is not discovering betrayal. It is remembering when you needed someone most, and realizing you no longer occupied the place you believed you held in that person's life. But Phoebe did not yet understand that the photograph was only the first layer. She still thought she had to face only an unfaithful husband. She did not understand that behind Grant's absences was something more dangerous, and that this time what had been placed in other people's hands was not only her heart but her name. Phoebe did not text Grant after seeing the blue bracelet. She did not send him the photograph with a question whose answer she already knew. Her phone rested on her knees, the screen light touching her face in the dark living room, while the windows across the street went out one by one. She enlarged the photo once more. The bracelet remained there on the wrist of the woman who had stood beside her husband on the exact night Phoebe called him 6 times. She turned the screen off. The impulse to ask where he had been, when it started, and what had happened between them remained strong. But behind those questions stood another she could no longer ignore. If Grant had been able to lie about a night so simple, then how should she understand the documents bearing her name? The next morning, Phoebe opened the blue folder on the dining table. She placed the confirmation from the gray envelope beside the notes she had written after Molly call. The two documents had different dates and different amounts, but both appeared after Phoebe had stepped almost completely away from work. She no longer had deep system access, and she did not intend to retrieve anything she was not authorized to view. She did only what she had done every workday before her leave. She observed what was in front of her and tested whether it followed normal logic. Her fingertips stopped over the signature. From a drawer, she took an old document she had signed months earlier, placed it beside the new one, and tilted both toward the window light. At first, the difference was difficult to see. Phoebe's real signature always had a final line that varied slightly, shorter or longer, depending on how fast her hand moved. Some days, the space between the P and the surname was wider. Other days, the letters almost touched. But on the two new approvals, every detail matched too exactly. A tiny ink dot at the beginning of the stroke, a narrow white space under the same letter, even the final downward tilt. Phoebe placed one page over the other. The strokes occupied almost the same position. She called Molly. Molly did not immediately call it a forgery. She asked Phoebe to describe exactly what she saw. When Phoebe explained that the two signatures matched even in the smallest details, she heard the faint scrape of a chair on the other end. Molly said slowly that two handwritten signatures should not be absolutely identical, especially on documents prepared days apart. "Do you still have old documents with your real signature?" she asked. Phoebe looked at the papers on the table. Yes, Molly told her to preserve everything as it was. Not to mark the documents directly, and not to send them around carelessly. Her final sentence made the kitchen feel suddenly silent. "If this is only a system error, we will know. But do not sign anything else until we understand what is happening." That night, Grant came home earlier than usual. He placed 2 grocery bags on the table, took off his coat, and said he would cook. Phoebe stood near the kitchen watching him cut vegetables, open a bottle of sparkling water, and ask whether the baby had moved much that day. After weeks of dinners reduced to chair sounds and phone screens lighting between them, the sudden kindness almost made Phoebe forget the blue folder inside the drawer. When Grant placed his hand on his wife's belly and the baby moved directly beneath his palm, Phoebe lowered her eyes. Part of her still remembered nights when they joked about whether the movement was a foot or an elbow. The dangerous thing about familiar tenderness is that it can make every strange event look like something a simple explanation might repair. After dinner, Grant carried both plates to the sink and returned with a small set of papers. He placed them beside Phoebe's water glass. "Since we are sitting down, sign these for me," he said. Phoebe did not take the pen. She turned the pages slowly. The first 2 were administrative confirmations that did not seem unusual. The third made her fingers stop. At the top was her name. Beneath it was a paragraph confirming that before beginning maternity leave, Phoebe had completed review and handover of all financial files within her responsibility. Grant moved the pen closer. "It is just a formality, so they can close out the handover." Phoebe read it again. If she signed, she would not only confirm her leave date, she would also confirm that she had reviewed the very documents now appearing under her name. She looked up. Grant stood on the other side of the table with a calm face and one hand resting on the back of the chair. Phoebe closed the papers. For the first time, she understood that perhaps her real signature was precisely what Grant was waiting for. She did not refuse immediately. She raised one hand to her forehead as if tired, moved the papers aside, and said her eyes hurt after reading all day. "I will review them tomorrow and sign calmly," she said. Grant looked at the pen still lying in the middle of the table. For one very short instant, the tenderness from dinner vanished from his face. He asked what could possibly be in a simple handover form that required so much time. Phoebe did not argue. She only reminded him that he had always told employees never to sign anything before reading it. That answer made him silent. A few seconds later, He slipped the pen into his shirt pocket, said she could review it if she wanted, and went into the bathroom. Phoebe stayed seated until she heard water running behind the door. Only then did she take her phone and photograph every page. The next morning, as soon as sunlight touched the edge of the kitchen table, Phoebe called Molly. She did not send the full packet. She only read the part of the declaration directly related to her old responsibilities. Molly listened to the end, then asked whether they wanted Phoebe to sign with the current date or an earlier date. Phoebe looked at the blank date line. The question made her hands cold. Molly explained briefly that if Phoebe signed a statement confirming she had fully reviewed all files before leave, any document carrying her name from that period could be presented as something she had known about or approved. It would not automatically prove wrongdoing, but it would make it much harder to separate her responsibility from irregular files. Phoebe sat in silence by the table. Traffic noise drifted through the half-open window. She looked at the baby crib still unfinished in the corner of the living room. Then back at the papers Grant had left. "Then I will not sign," she said. Molly did not agree or disagree. She only said Phoebe had the right to request a clear explanation of anything bearing her name before confirming it. That calm helped Phoebe breathe steadily. She did not need to prove what Grant was doing that morning. She only needed not to add her authentic signature to something she did not understand. When Grant returned, the first thing he asked was not about Phoebe's health or the baby. His eyes went straight to the documents lying exactly where he had left them. "Did you sign?" Phoebe said no. He removed his watch and set it on the table harder than usual. "What are you waiting for?" Phoebe replied that she wanted to know which files were included in the review before signing a general confirmation. Grant turned toward her. "Did Molly call you?" The question came too fast. Phoebe had not mentioned Molly in days. She did not answer right away. Grant kept asking whether she planned to return to the company soon, whether she was reviewing old documents, and why her phone always seemed locked lately. Each question alone could have sounded like a husband worried about his tense wife. But together they formed another picture. Grant no longer wanted only for Phoebe to rest. He wanted to know how much she had. That night, after Grant left for another meeting, Phoebe opened the documents related directly to her. She did not search secret accounts or try to trace operations outside her authorization. She only compared the name of an entity appearing on one expense with information she had received before taking leave. One name stopped her. It was a property management company that had appeared earlier in company administrative emails. Phoebe remembered seeing the same name more recently, though it took her almost 10 minutes to place it. Sienna. A few weeks earlier, during a brief conversation at an internal event, Sienna had mentioned moving into an apartment near downtown. When Phoebe searched again for the public photo from the night Grant missed her calls, the location tagged beneath it showed that the building belonged to the same management system that now appeared in the payment file. That still did not prove the company was paying for Sienna's apartment. Phoebe knew that limit. But for the first time, the affair and the financial movements carrying her signature sat close enough that she could no longer treat them as separate matters. She wrote the management company name on a small sheet of paper and stopped. What now drew her attention was inside the documents already in front of her. Another approval bearing her name had been issued on the same day Grant had personally driven her to the hospital for a persistent pain. Phoebe remembered that morning clearly. Grant had sat beside her bed for nearly 2 hours and had carried both her purse and her medical papers when they left. If he later claimed Phoebe had been at the company signing that document, Grant could not say he did not know where she had been. He had been beside her. Phoebe stared at the date for a long time. The question was no longer whether Grant knew those signatures were irregular. The new question was this: if he knew Phoebe could not have signed, why did he still need her to place a real signature on the handover document? During the next 2 days, Phoebe almost stopped mentioning the documents. Grant did not place them in front of her again. But the silence between them changed. He still asked what she wanted to eat, he still left vitamins on the table in the morning, and still leaned down to touch his wife's belly when the baby moved. Yet behind those familiar gestures, Phoebe began seeing something she had never considered. Grant had drifted far enough from her to have another woman. He had lied about the nights he did not come home, and even allowed Sienna to appear beside him at company events. So why did he never talk about separation? Every time Phoebe tried to discuss the distance between them, Grant always answered with the same sentence. They should wait until the baby was born and then talk. One morning, Phoebe sat by the window with the blue folder open on her lap and remembered the last months. Grant had never truly tried to recover the marriage they used to have. He had only made sure it did not break at that moment. When Phoebe became hurt that he came home late, he apologized just enough to end the conversation. When she asked about the company, he told her to focus on the pregnancy. When the distance between them became too visible, he reminded her everything would be different in a few months. Before, Phoebe had thought he was postponing a painful conversation because he did not want to stress her. Now the handover papers made that explanation lose its shape. If Phoebe left the marriage at that moment, questions might be raised about her work, her authority, and the handover. If she remained Grant's wife, stayed home caring for the pregnancy, and occasionally signed documents he brought her, nobody would have reason to ask too soon. Phoebe did not know whether that was the whole truth. But for the first time, she began to see the phrase "wait until the baby is born" as a period of time Grant needed, not as a space he was protecting for their family. That afternoon, Harriet stopped by with another night lamp for the baby room. Phoebe did not take long to reach the point. When both women sat at the table, Phoebe set down her tea and mentioned Sienna. "Do you know her?" she asked. Harriet became still for a moment. She said Sienna worked at the same company, often accompanied Grant to events, and that there was nothing strange about them appearing together. Phoebe looked directly at her. "I am not asking about work." Harriet was silent. That silence answered enough. After a moment, she moved the plate of cookies closer and avoided Phoebe's eyes. "Grant is under enormous pressure. You two have been distant for a while." Phoebe heard the spoon strike the edge of the cup. She asked whether Harriet knew Grant and Sienna were having a relationship. Harriet did not deny it. Instead, she spoke slowly. "Sometimes men look for peace somewhere else when there is too much tension at home." Phoebe did not answer. She placed one hand on her belly and felt a soft kick from inside. No one shouted. No cup fell. Phoebe simply stood and carried the teapot into the kitchen. When she returned, she asked another question. "Do you know Grant has been bringing me company documents to sign?" This time Harriet's head lifted immediately. "What documents?" That reaction was enough for Phoebe to understand that her mother-in-law might know about Sienna, but she did not know the rest. Phoebe did not explain more. She walked Harriet to the door as always. When the door closed, she rested a hand on the knob for several seconds and returned to the living room. One layer of secrets had just separated from another. The affair was something Harriet was willing to excuse. The signatures were not. The next morning, Phoebe gathered the documents directly bearing her name, the prenatal calendar, and the photographs of the papers Grant wanted signed. She did not carry suspicions about Sienna, and she did not tell the story as a wife trying to punish her husband. In an intake office inside a gray government building, Phoebe sat across from a compliance investigator, placed each document on the table, and said the only thing she could state with certainty: "These signatures are under my name, but I did not write them." The investigator asked whether she wanted to identify who had written them. Phoebe shook her head. "I do not know who placed them in those files. I only need to prove they are not mine." The investigator reviewed the medical calendar, compared the dates, and asked more questions about Phoebe's former permissions. The moment she reduced her hours, the day she stopped working, and who could access old document templates, Phoebe answered only what she knew. She did not fill gaps with guesses. At the end, the investigator closed the folder and looked at her. "If these signatures are not yours, do you know who benefits if everyone believes they are authentic?" Phoebe did not answer at once. Through the glass, a car moved slowly through the intersection and disappeared behind a row of buildings. Phoebe thought of Sienna, the handover document, the times Grant had asked whether Molly called, and the day in the hospital when Grant had been sitting right beside her. For the first time, she did not need more time to think of the answer. Trusting someone has never meant living beside them like a detective. Nobody enters a marriage believing every call must be checked, every explanation verified. and every document preserved in case it becomes evidence one day. Phoebe had trusted Grant because that was how she understood shared life. A place where two people did not have to prove innocence to each other over and over. But there is a clear difference between trust and closing one eyes to what is harming them. When Phoebe preserved the papers bearing her name, refused to sign the handover, and brought what belonged to her for review, she did not become suspicious. She stopped handing control of her life to a person who had begun using her trust differently. From that moment on, Phoebe's silence changed, meaning, before, she stayed silent because she wanted to preserve her family. Now she stayed silent to observe, protect herself, and prevent Grant from realizing that the wife he believed would always yield had started seeing the road ahead clearly. After that meeting, Phoebe did not receive an immediate result. The investigator only asked her to keep the documents intact, sign no further confirmations related to the handover period, and be ready to provide dates if comparisons were needed. Phoebe returned to the apartment as afternoon began to fade. Grant was not home. She placed the blue folder in the lower drawer of the baby wardrobe, beneath folded newborn clothes. Then she went to the kitchen, washed an apple, and sat down to eat it like any other day. What had changed was not in the apartment, it was in the way she saw everything that had happened. Certain points confirmed over the next days were enough for Phoebe to understand the structure of the problem without knowing every detail inside the company. Before leave, she had been responsible for controlling many payments. It was normal for her name and signature to appear on old files. After she stepped away, Grant assumed much of the operational control. If someone later questioned irregular movements, he could tell a simple story. That system already existed when Phoebe managed those approvals. Files bearing her name had been created while she was responsible. Then Phoebe left on maternity leave, while Grant merely took over what was already functioning. The story did not need to be perfect. It only needed to make people spend enough time questioning Phoebe before questioning Grant. She understood it one morning, when she placed 3 dates on the table. The day she officially reduced her hours, the day she stopped working entirely, and the dates when documents with identical signatures began appearing. Several records sat too close to those boundaries. If she signed the handover statement, Grant would have something else to claim that Phoebe had reviewed everything before leaving. Only then did she understand why he needed a real signature so much. Old copies could build a file, but one fresh confirmation signed by Phoebe could make that story far more coherent. That same afternoon, Phoebe received a message from an old company friend asking about her health and mentioning that everyone had heard Grant say the pregnancy had forced Phoebe to step away longer than expected. Phoebe read that sentence twice. Hours later, during another call, Molly mentioned almost casually that Grant had said in a meeting Phoebe had not been closely tracking files even before official leave. The phrasing did not directly blame her. It sounded almost sympathetic, but Phoebe had worked with language and records long enough to recognize when someone was preparing a version of events. Grant was not saying Phoebe made mistakes. He was planting the idea that she was tired, that she had drifted away from the work before she fully controlled everything under her responsibility, and that she had left behind a system others had to assume. That night, Grant came home with a colleague who had been close to both of them for years. The man only stopped by to pick up documents. Before leaving, he asked Phoebe if she felt better. Phoebe said she was fine. He smiled politely and said Grant had mentioned that by the end she had been so tired she barely touched any work. The room went silent for a moment. Grant stood near the bookcase. He quickly said he only wanted everyone to understand that Phoebe needed rest, and that no one should call to bother her. Phoebe looked at him. "Do you remember the date I stopped working?" Grant frowned slightly. "Why ask that now?" "I am just asking." He gave a date nearly 2 weeks wrong. Phoebe did not correct him. She only nodded and watched the colleague leave the apartment. When the door closed, Grant asked why she had started speaking as if she were testing him. Phoebe answered that she wanted to remember the dates correctly before the baby was born. Grant looked at her for several seconds, then took his phone and went into another room. The next day, Molly called while Phoebe was choosing baby clothes. Her voice sounded more tense than usual. The company was preparing a large celebration the following week to announce a new management phase and present changes in staff responsibilities. Phoebe asked why Molly was telling her. Because your name is still on the guest list, Molly said. Phoebe stopped moving. Molly continued, explaining that Grant would give a speech about the transition process from recent months. Several former employees from Phoebe's team were invited too. Then Molly paused before adding one more detail. On the executive seating arrangement, Sienna Royce's name was placed right next to Grant. Phoebe looked at the old office dress still hanging in the corner of her closet. Now she knew what story Grant was preparing about the past. What she did not know was how many people he intended to tell it to during that celebration. After Molly's call, Phoebe stopped asking Grant what time he would come home. She no longer watched the clock each time the elevator stopped in the hallway. No longer guessed who made his phone vibrate when it lay face down on the table. And no longer opened the photo of Sienna just to hurt herself again. The change did not happen overnight. It began with small things. Phoebe stopped keeping Grant's dinner portion warm in the oven. She moved the prenatal calendar to a private app on her phone. She changed her passcode. She hid the blue folder somewhere only she knew. Each morning, when Grant left, she no longer stood near the door asking whether he would be back for dinner. She nodded when he said he had a meeting and returned to what she was doing. That silence caught Grant's attention faster than Phoebe expected. One night he came home around 10, left his keys on the table, and stared at his wife as she sat by the sofa folding baby clothes. "Are you not going to ask where I was?" Phoebe folded a tiny onesie in half, smoothed the collar, and placed it in the drawer. "You said you had work." Grant stood still for a few seconds. Before, if he returned 2 hours late, Phoebe would ask at least once. Now she asked nothing. He went into the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, and came back out as if waiting for an argument that never arrived. During the following days, Grant began asking more and more questions about her. Where did she go in the mornings? Who called her? Was Molly still in contact? Why was her phone always locked? Why was the old laptop no longer in the living room? Phoebe answered briefly, and only as much as necessary. She went to medical appointments. She spoke with her mother. Molly asked about her health. None of her answers were lies. But none opened her life to him completely anymore. The old laptop was the first time Grant pushed too far. He searched for it one Saturday afternoon, opened the cabinet under the desk, and started pulling out drawers. Phoebe stood in the doorway with a glass of water. "What are you looking for?" Grant said he needed to review old forms because some files were missing from company computers. Phoebe said she had put the laptop away. He turned toward her. "Where?" Phoebe took a sip of water and answered naturally. "I keep my own things." Grant looked at her longer than necessary. "What are you doing?" "Phoebe, I am keeping my own things." No one shouted. No one slammed a door, but it was the first time Phoebe saw a clear line between them, and did not rush to erase it to keep peace. Grant left the room after a few seconds while Phoebe remained at the doorway, until she heard him enter the living room. The following afternoon, Denise arrived with a pot of soup and a bag of oranges. Phoebe sat with her mother at the kitchen table while the sky beyond the window turned gray. She had not told Denise everything about the documents. She only said that things between her and Grant were more serious than her mother knew. Denise did not press. She peeled an orange, placed the sections on a plate, and waited. Phoebe lowered her eyes to her belly. "What if I need to come stay with you for a while?" The small knife in Denise's hand stopped. She did not ask for how long. She did not ask what Grant had done. She set down the knife, wiped her hands on a towel, and said Phoebe did not need permission to come home. Phoebe looked down and took an orange section. She did not cry. She ate slowly, as if she needed a few more seconds for those words to find a place inside her. Since becoming pregnant, she had grown used to balancing every decision among the doctor, work, Grant, and what others believed was best for her. For the first time in many weeks, there was a place that did not demand explanations before she could enter. 3 days later, Grant came home early with a paper bag from a maternity boutique. He left it on the bed and asked Phoebe to open it. Inside was a pale maternity dress, more formal than anything she wore at home. Phoebe touched the soft fabric. "What is this for?" Grant stood near the closet, unbuttoning his cuffs. "Nothing. I thought it would look nice on you." Phoebe looked at him. The company event was less than a week away. And the celebration. Grant turned to hang his coat. You do not need to go. There will be too many people. And standing that long is not good for you. The sentence sounded concerned. But Phoebe had heard enough concern used to decide for her. When Grant went to shower, she carried the dress into the living room. A pile of unopened mail sat on the table. Among bills and ads lay a thick cream envelope she had not noticed the day before. She opened it. Inside was the official company invitation. Her name appeared clearly in the guests section. Phoebe Langston Holloway. Not as Grant guest. Not as Grant wife. Her own name. Alongside her former title, Phoebe looked toward the hallway, where water still ran behind the bathroom door. Then back at the dress Grant had bought, he had just told her she did not need to attend a celebration where the company itself still expected her. For the first time, Phoebe wondered whether Grant truly wanted her at home or only wanted to control exactly when she could enter that room. The answer came the next morning. Not from Grant but from the handover packet he still had not taken away. Phoebe opened every page on the kitchen table. At the end was part of the event program she had barely reviewed before. After Grant's speech about the new management phase, there would be a short section confirming transfer of responsibilities between the prior control team and the current team. Phoebe's name appeared on the list. Not to speak. Not to receive thanks. Only to complete a brief formality in front of selected people. Phoebe left the papers on the table. The contradiction was now clear. Grant did not want her standing long in the ballroom. He did not want her speaking with former employees, and certainly did not want her asking questions not written into the program. Yet he needed her to appear long enough to place her signature on the confirmation. After that, she could leave. While Grant stayed to talk about a new phase, as if everything before had closed neatly, Phoebe did not know if that was the whole plan. She did not need to know. The repeated pressure to sign a document he did not want her to read carefully was enough. She called Molly and asked one question. If I attend the event and refuse to sign, can that cause me trouble? Molly said no one had the right to force her to confirm something she did not agree with. Then she lowered her voice. If you go, do not go alone without telling anyone. Phoebe looked out the window. You will be there. I have to work. Molly said. That was enough. That afternoon, Phoebe went to Denise's house. She did not explain the verification process in detail. She said she would attend a company event on Saturday night and might come home late. Denise was folding towels on the dining table and asked whether Grant would go with her. Phoebe answered that he would be there. But they would not arrive together. Denise stopped moving her hands. Do you want me to drive you? Phoebe shook her head. She would call a car herself. All she needed was for someone to know exactly where she would be and what time to call if Phoebe did not check in. Before she left, Denise looked at her shoes and reminded her not to wear the high heels she used to wear to corporate events. Phoebe looked down at her very noticeable belly and gave the slightest smile. I know. I need to stand steady. They said nothing more. That night, Phoebe took low-heeled shoes from the closet and placed them beside the ivory maternity dress she had chosen instead of the one Grant bought. It was not flashy. It did not look like a challenge. It was simply formal enough for a woman who had once held an important role inside the company to enter under her own name. In the days before the event, Grant became unpredictable. Sometimes he gently asked whether she needed more rest. Other times he suddenly asked whether she had decided to attend. When Phoebe said yes, Grant frowned. I told you that you do not need to go. My name is still on the program. She replied. He immediately said it was an old list that had not been updated. Phoebe did not argue. If it was truly old, Grant could have asked them to remove her name. But he did not. On the evening of the event, Grant changed clothes in the bedroom and left before her. He said he needed to arrive early to check the stage, and reminded Phoebe that if she felt tired, she could stay home. Phoebe waited until the door closed before preparing. She showered, pinned her hair neatly at the nape of her neck, put on the ivory maternity dress, and sat down to fasten the low-heeled shoes. Her phone was fully charged. In her purse, she carried only personal documents, a small bottle of water, and copies of the papers bearing her name. She had no plan to confront Sienna. She had prepared no speech. Phoebe only wanted to watch Grant place the handover document before her one more time and tell him clearly that she would not sign. The car stopped in front of the venue just after dark. Light from the lobby spilled through the tall windows and reflected in long strips across the street. Phoebe did not get out immediately. She sat for a few seconds more, watching guests enter in small groups. The phone in her hand vibrated with a new message. It came from the verification process and contained a document that had just been released to her because her name appeared in the file. She opened it. A short internal communication chain appeared on the screen. Only a few lines. Phoebe read it once. Then again. At the bottom was an instruction from Grant to the employee processing the files. Use Phoebe's old signature again. Traffic continued moving along the street. The driver looked at her in the mirror while waiting for her to open the door. Phoebe no longer saw Sienna in her mind. Not the blue bracelet. Not the nights Grant said he slept at the office. All the little questions had led to one answer now lying in front of her. Grant knew. Phoebe locked the screen, placed the phone in her purse, and opened the car door. Ahead stood the ballroom where Grant was waiting for one last signature. This time, Phoebe entered without doubt. Phoebe walked through the glass doors of the grand ballroom, just as the background music shifted to a slower song. Light fell from the high ceiling over white-covered tables, lined glasses, and the stage at the far end. Her ivory dress fit gently around her pronounced belly, and her low heels let her walk steadily over the polished floor. Nobody looked at her like a woman who had come to cause a scene. Several former co-workers greeted her. They asked about her health and the baby. Phoebe smiled briefly, but her eyes had already found Grant across the room. He stood beside Sienna. That place had once been familiar to Phoebe. Before taking leave, at major events, she had stayed beside Grant to receive guests. Remember partner names. Remind him of the schedule. And sometimes answer questions about numbers. That night, Sienna occupied exactly that space. She wore a dark dress, and on her wrist was the blue teardrop bracelet from the photograph. Grant was speaking with a group of guests, but the moment he saw his wife, he stopped mid-sentence. Irritation appeared clearly on his face for one instant before courtesy replaced it. Harriet approached first. She lightly held Phoebe's elbow and guided her toward the windows. Grant said you were staying home. Phoebe looked over Harriet's shoulder. Sienna had stepped back half a pace from Grant, but she had not left. I changed my mind. Harriet lowered her voice and reminded Phoebe there were many partners and employees present, and that this was not the proper time for family matters. Phoebe did not mention Sienna. She did not ask why that woman could remain beside her husband in front of everyone. She only said, I came to read what Grant wants me to sign. Harriet became slightly still. Before she could ask more, the microphone sounded from the stage. Grant had already stepped up. Conversations faded, and the lights at the front brightened. Phoebe remained near the end of a table with one hand resting gently on the back of a chair. Grant spoke of a year full of change, new projects, and a team that had assumed additional responsibility. His voice was controlled and confident, barely needing the notes in front of him. Phoebe had heard him give speeches many times. She knew one of Grant's greatest skills was turning a carefully designed sentence into something that sounded obvious. Then he mentioned her name. Grant said Phoebe had been responsible for a significant part of financial control before temporarily stepping back because of health concerns and pregnancy. He thanked her for her contributions during the earlier phase, then explained that the current team had taken on a considerable amount of work to complete the transition. No sentence directly accused Phoebe, but every word drew a clear line. Everything belonging to the previous stage was associated with her, while everything now being corrected and assumed belonged to Grant and the new team. Some people turned toward Phoebe. She did not avoid their eyes. Immediately after, Grant invited Sienna to stand with the group leading the new phase. Applause filled the ballroom. Sienna stood beside him under the stage lights with a tense face and a steady smile. Phoebe watched only a few seconds before lowering her eyes to open her water bottle. The betrayal that had cost her sleep weeks earlier was no longer the most dangerous thing in that room. When the speech ended, Grant came down from the stage and walked directly toward her. He did not touch her. He only said they needed to talk and led her to a space near a side hallway. far enough from the stage not to draw attention, but still within view of Molly and several employees. On a small table by the wall lay a set of documents and a pen. Phoebe looked at them. It was the handover statement. "I already explained this." Grant said, "Sign. And then you can go rest." Phoebe turned each page. Though she remembered almost every word, Grant stood beside her, constantly glancing toward the ballroom. When Phoebe reached the final page, he moved the pen closer. She did not take it. "I am not signing." Grant turned fully toward her. "Phoebe, do not start here." She lifted her eyes and kept her voice low. "Are you sure every approval carrying my name was made by me?" For 1 second, Grant's face went completely still. It was not anger. It was calculation. He asked what she meant. Phoebe did not answer. The phone in her hand had lit up with a notification, and the document she received before leaving the car was still open on the screen. Grant looked down reflexively. His eyes stopped on the last line. "Use Phoebe old signature again." The calm disappeared from his face. He looked at Phoebe, then at the phone, then stepped toward her. Grant did not lunge immediately. The slowness of those first seconds made the scene more tense. He took 1 step, placing himself between her and the way back to the ballroom, and lowered his voice so that people farther away could barely hear. "Give me the phone." Phoebe turned off the screen and kept the device in her hand. "No." Grant looked around. Behind him, the music had resumed. Guests were moving among tables, and Sienna stood near the stage, speaking with someone from communications. No one had full attention on them, but they were not really private. "Where did you get that?" Phoebe did not answer. "You saw what you needed to see." Grant extended his hand. "Give it to me." Phoebe stepped back. She did not want a fight in the middle of the event, and she had no intention of explaining how far the verification had gone. What she needed to do was clear. Refuse to sign, keep her phone, and leave if Grant lost control. She turned slightly toward the ballroom. Grant moved after her, still trying to keep his voice low. He said the message could be misunderstood, that Phoebe did not know what was happening inside the company, and that if she started carrying those documents around and saying things without context, everything would be worse for her. The last phrase made Phoebe stop. "For me?" Grant did not answer. He reached again for the phone. Phoebe took another step back. The low heel settled firmly on the stone floor. For one flashing moment, Denise's words from before the event crossed her mind. "Do not wear the high heels you usually wear." Phoebe had never imagined such a small detail would matter days later. "I am not giving it to you," she said. Grant looked at the screen, which had lit again in her hand with another notification. He moved faster and grabbed Phoebe's wrist. She pulled back by reflex. "Let go of me." Her voice was not loud, but it was enough for Sienna to turn her head. Molly also looked up from a farther table. Grant kept holding his wife's wrist. He said he only wanted to review the document, but his grip tightened when Phoebe tried to free herself. For one moment she felt her balance shift. Her other hand went instantly to her belly. "Let go, Grant." The second warning was clearer. Several people nearby stopped talking. Grant realized they were watching. Perhaps that was why he tried to end it quickly. He pulled Phoebe toward him while reaching with his other hand for the phone. Phoebe stepped back, but Grant still had her wrist. She felt tension in her abdomen as her body turned sideways. There was no time left to think about Sienna, the forged signatures, or the speech she had just heard. Everything came down to one simple fact. Grant was still holding her after she had asked him to let go. Phoebe planted her right foot firmly, turned her upper body so her belly was not directly in front of him, kept one hand over it, and used her left leg to kick him hard in the torso to create distance. It was not elegant. It was not a practiced move. It was the urgent force of a person escaping a hand that refused to release her. Grant was not prepared. His hand broke away from her wrist, and his body stumbled backward. His heel caught against the leg of a chair. The chair slid loudly across the stone floor. Grant tried to recover, struck the edge of a table, and fell into the open space between guests. A wine glass flew from the table, hit the floor, and shattered. The sharp sound cut through the music. The ballroom became almost completely silent. Harriet rose abruptly and called her son name. Sienna stood frozen a few yards away, looking first at Grant on the floor and then at the red mark on Phoebe's wrist. Molly had already left her place and moved closer. Though she did not touch Phoebe yet, Grant pushed one hand against the floor and stood. His face was red from pain and humiliation. Phoebe stayed where she was, one hand on her belly and the other holding her phone. She did not move toward him. She said nothing more. Just as Grant fully straightened, the tall doors at the back of the ballroom opened. A group of people entered. None wore evening clothes. The few conversations that had begun to rise died at once. Grant looked over Phoebe's shoulder. His eyes stopped on the group moving toward them, then returned slowly to his wife. Then something strange happened. He smiled. It was not joy. It looked like the relief of a man seeing the final part of a plan arrive. Grant adjusted his collar, straightened his posture, and glanced quickly at the phone Phoebe held. In that instant, Phoebe understood what he was thinking. He believed the documents carrying her name were enough. He believed the people entering the ballroom would first come to question her. The man at the front approached, past Phoebe, and did not stop. The second person passed too. Then the third. The smile on Grant's face began to fade as the entire group stopped directly in front of him. The people who had entered the ballroom stood before Grant, leaving a small open space between tables. No one raised a voice. The lead investigator introduced himself briefly and asked Grant to cooperate because several files, devices, and company transactions were under verification. The last trace of Grant's smile disappeared. He looked toward Phoebe, as if still expecting someone to say her name. When that did not happen, he immediately pointed at his wife. She was in charge of those files. Every signature carries her name. The sentence came out so fast that everyone nearby heard it clearly. Phoebe did not answer. She only held her phone while the wrist he had just grabbed remained red under the lights. The investigator did not argue with Grant in the ballroom. He simply explained that dates, access records, and certain documents had already been compared, and that responsibility for each person would be clarified through the review process. That was enough to change Grant's expression. He looked at Phoebe again. This time he did not have the certainty of a man who believed his version was fully prepared. Another question appeared in his eyes. What had Phoebe given outside the company? And since when? An employee was asked to accompany the group to the workspace connected to the documents. Another person began speaking to Grant about the phone and computer he was using. When they moved toward the bag near the stage, Grant stepped forward and raised his voice more than before. He said it was only an internal misunderstanding, that the company had gone through an incomplete handover, and that Phoebe had taken maternity leave when many files were still pending. The sentences he had planted among employees for weeks now gathered into one complete explanation before everyone. But this time no one nodded. Molly stood a few steps from Phoebe, hands clasped tightly in front of her. Several former co-workers looked from Grant to Phoebe, clearly beginning to understand that the words about the previous stage in his speech had not been as innocent as they first sounded. Phoebe stayed silent. She did not need to defend herself sentence by sentence in the ballroom. The days she had spent at the clinic, the exact moment she stopped working, and the signatures identical in the smallest details all existed before Grant began speaking that night. Sienna was the first person to truly break the situation open. Grant turned toward her when one of the investigators asked about certain documents carrying signatures from several employees. "Do not say anything right now," he told her. Low and urgent. Sienna stayed still for a few seconds. Her eyes moved from Grant's phone to the people waiting for an answer and finally to Phoebe. The confidence she had shown on stage was gone. "Those documents," Sienna said, and swallowed. "You told me to sign them." Grant turned sharply. "You do not understand what you are saying. You said it was only a formality." The second sentence made several people nearby turn at once. Sienna did not move toward Phoebe or seek sympathy. She simply stepped farther away from Grant, like someone who had just realized she had to protect herself before it was too late. Harriet crossed the group then. She had been still since the officials entered. But after hearing Sienna, The irritation she had directed at Phoebe vanished from her face. Grant. He turned toward his mother almost by instinct. Perhaps for years. She had been where he looked when he needed someone to soften a scandal. Explain something for him. Or remove another person from the room. But Harriet did not step in front of her son to protect him. She only asked, "What have you done?" Grant opened his mouth and stopped. At that instant, Phoebe understood what had changed. The man before her had placed Sienna in his wife's place. He had used Harriet as a shield to protect the family image. He had used employees to build documents and used Phoebe's name to prepare an exit for himself. Now Sienna had stepped away. Harriet no longer defended him. Molly stood with what she had seen. The guests no longer looked at Phoebe as the source of the problem. There was no one left standing in front of Grant. A sudden contraction crossed Phoebe's abdomen and forced her to breathe deeply. Molly noticed even before Phoebe spoke. She held Phoebe's elbow gently but did not pull. Phoebe stayed still for several seconds, waiting for the tightness to ease. After the struggle minutes earlier, she did not want to risk anything else. Molly called Denise while Phoebe took her coat. Behind her, Grant said her name once, then again louder. Phoebe did not turn. When Denise arrived, she looked only once at her daughter's wrist and helped her into the car. The ballroom remained brightly lit behind them, but the closing glass doors almost completely muted the voices. On the ride to the clinic, Phoebe leaned against the seat with one hand on her belly, focusing on every movement of the baby. The phone inside her purse vibrated without pause. Grant's name appeared again and again. Phoebe watched the light for a few seconds, then placed the phone face down on the seat. For the first time in many months, she no longer wanted to know what explanation her husband was preparing. The exam room light was almost cold white. Phoebe lay on her side in a hospital gown while Denise sat beside her, holding her daughter's purse on her knees. The steady sound of the monitor filled the silence. After nearly an hour, the doctor said the baby remained well. The contractions were mainly caused by stress, and Phoebe needed strict rest over the next days. There was no sign that Ruby was about to be born that night. Phoebe closed her eyes and placed one hand on her belly. From the moment she left the ballroom until that second, that was the only answer she had been waiting for. Denise's phone had vibrated several times. Molly had written to ask how Phoebe was. Several old coworkers had tried to contact her too. Phoebe did not ask where they had taken Grant, what Sienna was saying, or how the event had ended. When the doctor returned with more rest instructions, the first thing Phoebe asked was whether her daughter was fine. The doctor nodded again. Only then did Phoebe let her shoulders fully relax against the pillow. The following days moved much more slowly than the climax in the ballroom. Phoebe spent most of her time at her mother's house. Denise prepared the guest room again, added a chair near the window and a small table for medication, water, and the medical calendar. Everything involving the company went through proper channels. Phoebe answered only when the investigators needed dates belonging directly to her own life. The day she reduced her schedule, the day she stopped working completely, the medical appointments during pregnancy, and the devices she actually used. From those comparisons, the story Grant tried to build began separating itself from Phoebe's name. Some documents had been created on days when medical records confirmed she was at the clinic. The signatures on multiple forms matched with impossible precision and were determined to be copied images from old documents. Some access took place from devices Phoebe had not used after leave. The remaining information came from the company's systems. Without Phoebe needing to search anything on her own, she did not know everything happening behind the process. And she did not ask for every detail. The most important thing was that her name was no longer where Grant had tried to push it. Molly called one afternoon while Phoebe sorted newborn clothes. She shared little about the company, only that everyone was being asked to cooperate and certain files had been held for review. Phoebe listened while folding a tiny white shirt. And Sienna? She asked only once. Molly said Sienna had provided information related to documents she herself signed and stated that Grant had instructed her how to handle them. Phoebe asked nothing more. Sienna knew Grant was married. That did not disappear just because she too had been used. But Phoebe did not need to turn Sienna into the final enemy of her life. Harriet called 3 days later. Phoebe watched her mother-in-law name on the screen for a long time before answering. Harriet's voice no longer sounded firm as it had when she used to visit, and tell Phoebe not to make Grant feel pressured. Harriet asked to see her. She said she wanted to explain a few things and ask about the baby. Phoebe was sitting by the window, watching Denise hang small towels on the balcony. "Not yet," Phoebe said. Harriet was silent for several moments. Then said she understood. Phoebe ended the call. She felt no victory. She simply set down the phone and continued folding clothes. Also, if Harriet felt bad, Phoebe would have searched for softer words to make everyone more comfortable. Now she no longer believed she had to pay with her own peace to maintain the image of a family that had stopped existing. A week later, a courier brought an envelope with no company logo. Phoebe's name on the outside was written in Grant handwriting. She stood in the doorway looking at it before signing receipt. Denise did not ask what was inside. Phoebe took the envelope to the bedroom, opened the drawer beside the bed, and placed it at the bottom. She did not tear it open. She did not throw it away. The next morning, Phoebe pulled the still-boxed crib into the center of the living room. Denise held the instructions while Phoebe, seated in a chair, separated screws and pieces of wood into groups. The soft sound of tools touching the floor, the traffic outside, and the radio from the kitchen formed such an ordinary morning that Phoebe was surprised by how much she had missed ordinariness. When the crib was finally assembled, she stood before it with both hands on her belly. Grant's envelope remained unopened in the drawer. For the first time, what waited for Phoebe was no longer an answer from him. It was the day Ruby would arrive. The final weeks of pregnancy passed more slowly than Phoebe had imagined. After the night in the ballroom, she did not return to the apartment where she had lived with Grant. Denise helped her move what she needed into a small apartment a few blocks away. Close enough for help, but independent enough that Phoebe did not feel she had become a child in her mother home again. The apartment had 2 bedrooms, a living area connected to the kitchen, and a narrow balcony facing a row of street trees. A small desk sat by the window. Beside it was the crib mother and daughter had built together. There were no flowers meant as apologies, no phones placed face down on the table, and no lock turning after midnight. At night, Phoebe heard only traffic, the washing machine in the kitchen corner, and sometimes Ruby movements beneath her palm. Grant continued trying to contact her during the first weeks. But Phoebe no longer argued directly with him. Necessary matters went through the proper channels. Questions about documents were handled by the responsible people. Matters about the baby were preserved by Phoebe, answered when necessary, and never turned into conversations about the marriage. Finally, one rainy afternoon, Phoebe opened the envelope Grant had sent weeks earlier. Inside were several handwritten pages. He apologized for letting everything go so far. He said he had panicked, and that work pressure pushed him into terrible decisions. Phoebe read it once, folded it, and placed it in a box with documents. She did not tear it. She did not answer. Some explanations arrived too late. Not because the listener cannot understand them, but because they can no longer change what happened. The day Ruby was born began normally. Phoebe woke before 6 with a mild pain. She went to the kitchen for water and stood by the window looking at the dark street. She had grown used to false contractions, so she did not call her mother immediately. When the second came with a more regular rhythm, she set down the glass and looked at the clock. An hour later, Denise was already there with the hospital bag prepared weeks earlier. She did not rush or panic. She checked the documents one more time, locked the apartment, and helped her daughter into the car. By afternoon, the delivery room light had shifted from cold white to the soft orange of evening entering through the window. Phoebe had almost stopped tracking time. She listened only to the doctor's voice, Denise reminding her to breathe, and the short sounds of machines around her. Then, among all those sounds, came a cry. Phoebe opened her eyes. Minutes later, the baby was placed on her chest. Ruby was smaller than Phoebe had imagined every time she looked at the crib. Dark, damp hair lay against her head. Her hands were closed, and her face was red from crying. Phoebe touched one finger to her daughter's hand. Ruby gripped it by reflex. Denise turned away to wipe her tears. Phoebe said nothing. She held the baby closer. 2 days later, when she could sit up longer, Phoebe opened her phone for the first time without answering anything connected to Grant. Dozens of congratulation messages waited. Molly sent a photograph from Phoebe's old company. It showed the desk where Phoebe had once worked, now occupied by someone else. The computer was on. Several files were neatly placed in one corner. And the mug Phoebe used to leave by the window was gone. Under the photo, Molly had written one sentence. "When you are ready, you still have your profession?" Phoebe looked at the picture longer than expected. Months earlier, perhaps it would have hurt to see another person sitting in a place that had once been hers. Now she only looked at Ruby sleeping in the bassinet beside the bed and turned off the screen. That desk had never been what determined whether Phoebe remained the person she had always been. 3 months later, Ruby already turned her head when she heard her mother's voice, and often woke just as Phoebe placed coffee on the table. That morning, Phoebe sat on the rug folding clothes when the phone rang. It was Molly. After a few questions about Ruby, her voice became more serious. "There is an opening," she said. Phoebe stopped moving. "Not at the old place. A smaller company. They need someone in financial control." In the room, Ruby made a small sound and fell asleep again. Molly asked if Phoebe wanted to hear the offer. Phoebe looked toward the office jacket still hanging at the back of the closet since the day she moved into the apartment. This time she did not need long to answer. Yes. Phoebe did not return to work the next day. She took almost 2 weeks to understand the role Molly recommended. Speak with the hiring manager. And reorganize Ruby's daily routine. The new company was much smaller than Holloway Property Services. There were no grand ballrooms for events. No executives in trade magazines. And no impressive title designed to make people look twice. They needed someone able to review cash flow, rebuild approval procedures, and spot places where numbers failed to match before they became a problem. Phoebe read the job description twice and knew exactly what to do. What made her hesitate was not the work. It was Ruby. The first morning she tried working a few hours from home. Phoebe opened her laptop right after her daughter fell asleep. Less than 20 minutes later, Ruby began crying. Phoebe got up to prepare milk, change her diaper, and rock her for almost half an hour before she could lay her down again. When Phoebe returned to the desk, the screen had gone dark. She turned the computer back on, looked at the unfinished spreadsheet, and laughed quietly. Clearly, this return would not resemble the old years when Phoebe could sit before a screen until night and remember food only when Grant called. Denise helped her reorganize the rhythm of her days. She did not take Ruby all day so Phoebe could throw herself back into work as if she had never given birth. They divided time into periods. Phoebe began with a few hours a day, then increased slowly as Ruby adjusted. In the first weeks, Phoebe worked at the little desk by the window. One hand moved the mouse while her ears stayed alert to the baby monitor beside the crib. Some days she interrupted a meeting because Ruby woke. Other days she finished a report after dark. Nobody applauded those things. But each week she recovered another part of the professional rhythm she had once thought she had left behind. When the company formally offered her the position, Phoebe did not answer immediately on the call. She asked for a day to review the schedule, remote work expectations, and hours she needed to be present at the office. It was a small change, but Phoebe noticed it immediately. Before, she had tried to prove she could handle everything. Now she asked first what fit her own life before saying yes. On her first office day, Phoebe woke before dawn fully broke. Ruby slept in the crib with one small hand beside her cheek. Phoebe walked quietly to the kitchen, prepared milk, checked the baby bag, and only then returned to the bedroom to dress. Her dark office jacket had been pressed the night before. When she put it on, she stood a few seconds before the mirror. The reflection no longer resembled the woman who had worn an ivory dress in that ballroom. Her belly had nearly returned to its old shape. Her hair was neatly tied at the nape of her neck. Beneath her eyes were signs of many nights with too little sleep. On the chair behind her sat the bag with Ruby bottles and cloths. Denise arrived on time, took her granddaughter in her arms, let Phoebe check the bag a third time, and asked whether she was nervous. Phoebe looked at Ruby. "Yes," she said. Then she straightened the collar of her jacket and took her purse. "But I want to go." The new office was in a small building. No one waited at the entrance. There was no stage. No row of white-covered tables. No music. And no husband standing beside another woman. An employee showed Phoebe the work area, the coffee machine, and then led her to a desk near a window. On the desk sat a laptop, a new notebook, and 2 folders she needed to review during her first week. Phoebe sat down and opened the computer. The login screen appeared. For a moment her fingers stopped above the keyboard. She remembered the documents bearing her name without her hand. She remembered the days she had used her prenatal calendar to prove she had not been where others claimed she was. She remembered her name written on approvals Grant hoped to use as a shadow to hide behind. Phoebe entered the password. The main screen opened. In the upper corner appeared one simple line. Phoebe Langston. Not Grant wife. Not the pregnant woman who had taken leave. Not the name placed over a copied signature. Only Phoebe Langston. Sitting before work, she was truly doing. She opened the first folder. At the end of the day, Phoebe did not stay late to prove she was hardworking. When it was time to leave, she saved her work, closed the laptop, and walked out. When she opened the door of her apartment, she heard Ruby before she could take off her shoes. Denise sat on the sofa with the baby in her arms, while Ruby's small legs moved softly beneath a light blanket. Phoebe set down her purse, changed shoes by the door, washed her hands, and took her daughter. Ruby moved a few times before resting her cheek against her mother's chest and falling asleep again. Outside the window, there were no chandeliers, no ballroom music, no one speaking Grant's name, and no one waiting for Phoebe to sign any document. On the table by the window was the computer from her new job. In her arms was Ruby. The apartment was still as small as the first day Phoebe moved in. Her life had not become larger. It had simply become hers again. There are betrayals that do not begin with another woman. They begin when someone realizes their trust has been turned into a tool for another person's use. Phoebe once thought that if she were more patient, if she rested more, if she waited until her daughter was born, perhaps everything inside her family could be repaired. But what she had to learn was not how to make Grant stay. It was how to protect her own name, her daughter's future, and her right to say no when someone else tried to decide for her. The kick in the middle of the ballroom was not Phoebe's greatest victory. Neither were the restraints placed on Grant's wrists later through the process he had brought upon himself. The real victory came afterward. In a small apartment, when Ruby slept peacefully in her mother's arms, and Phoebe opened her laptop again to do the work she had always been good at. Without a stage. Without applause. Without needing anyone to witness it, just a woman who had finally recovered the life someone else had tried to write in silence for her. Sometimes beginning again does not mean becoming someone different. Sometimes it only means having enough courage to return to yourself. Thank you for staying with Phoebe's story until the final minutes. If this story made you think about trust, boundaries, and the strength of a woman who chooses to protect herself, share your thoughts in the comments. I will see you in the next story.